Now listen to me closely, because the story I am about to tell you is not just about the sins of the past. It is about the kind of justice that takes a lifetime to brew, slow and bitter like chicory coffee. It begins in the heavy, suffocating heat of Mississippi, in the year 1852, on a plantation that sprawled across the land like a sleeping beast. They called it Blackwood Manor. The name fit, because the soil there was so dark it looked like it had been stained by shadows, and the trees that lined the long driveway were ancient oaks that blocked out the sun, twisting their branches together like gnarled fingers. If you stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor, you could smell the sweetness of the magnolias, but underneath that, if you took a deep breath, you could smell the sweat, the fear, and the iron tang of cruelty. Ruling over this empire of cotton and silence was a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a man cut from granite and old money. He was handsome in a way that made you uneasy, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a smile that never quite reached them. He walked with a silver-tipped cane, not because he was lame, but because he liked the sound it made striking the floorboards, a sharp, rhythmic warning that the master was coming. Silas Thorne believed in three things: the superiority of his bloodline, the divine right of his ownership, and the absolute submission of every living thing that breathed his air. To the outside world, to the neighbors who came for grand balls and drank his imported brandy, Silas was a gentleman of the highest order. He was charming, witty, and generous with his compliments to the ladies. But the people who lived in the quarters, the souls he counted in his ledger alongside his cattle and his plows, they knew the truth. They knew that Silas Thorne was a man who would burn the world down just to see the ash fall. But Silas had a secret. It wasn't a hidden ledger or a buried treasure. It was a person, a young man named Julian. Julian was 20 years old in 1852, and if you saw him from a distance, working in the stables or polishing the silver in the dining room, your heart might skip a beat. He had the same sharp jawline as Silas Thorne. He had the same proud, straight nose. And most damning of all, he had those same winter sky eyes, startling and bright in a face that was the color of burnished bronze. It was the kind of resemblance that stopped conversation when he entered a room. Everyone knew. The neighbors whispered behind their fans. The overseers muttered about it in the fields, and Silas's wife, a fragile, bitter woman named Cordelia, spent her days in a darkened room with a migraine, trying to pretend Julian didn't exist. But Julian did exist. He was the living, breathing proof of Silas Thorne's hypocrisy. He was the son Silas had fathered with a housemaid named Sarah, a woman of grace and quiet strength who had died when Julian was just a boy, leaving him alone in the lion's den. Julian was not treated like a son. In fact, Silas seemed to hate him with a special, focused intensity. It was as if seeing his own face on a man he owned was an insult he couldn't bear. Julian was kept close, working in the main house, not out of affection, but because Silas wanted to control him. He wanted to break him. He wanted to scrub the thorn out of him with hard labor and constant humiliation. "You are nothing," Silas would say, often when guests were present, enjoying the flinch in Julian's shoulders. "You are a tool, a piece of furniture that eats." But Julian never flinched. He had inherited his mother's quiet grace, but deep down, in the furnace of his soul, he had his father's iron will. He took the insults. He took the long hours. He took the cold, dismissive glances. And he waited. He watched Silas Thorne the way a wolf watches a deer, memorizing his habits, his weaknesses, and his fears. Julian educated himself in the shadows. When the house slept, he would creep into the library, reading by the light of a stolen candle stub. He learned about law. He learned about economics. He learned the very language of power that Silas used to keep him in chains. The incident that changed everything, the spark that finally lit the fuse of Julian's lifelong plan, happened on a humid Tuesday in November. It was the day of the great harvest celebration. Silas had invited the wealthiest planters from 3 counties to Blackwood Manor. The dining room was a spectacle of excess. The chandelier glittered with 100 crystals, casting fractured rainbows over the table laden with roast duck, venison, and towers of fruit. Julian was serving wine. He moved silently, invisible in his uniform, pouring the dark red liquid with a steady hand. The conversation at the table had turned, as it often did, to the future. A bloated man from the neighboring estate, wiping grease from his chin, slammed his hand on the table. Legacy, Silas, he boomed. That is what matters. Who will inherit this kingdom you've built? You have no legitimate heir. Cordelia has given you no sons. The room went quiet. It was a sore subject. Silas Thorne's face tightened. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes flicking for a split second to Julian, who was standing by the sideboard. My legacy, Silas said, his voice smooth and cold, is the land. The land endures. Blood can be diluted, blood can be weak, but the deed to Blackwood is written in ink and law. I would rather leave this estate to the rats in the cellar than to unworthy blood. He paused, and then, with a cruel smile, he pointed a finger at Julian. Come here, boy. Julian stepped forward, his face impassive. Silas looked at his guests. Look at this, Silas sneered, gesturing to Julian as if he were a prize horse. People talk. They say there is a resemblance. They say I should be softer on him. Silas stood up, leaning on his cane, towering over Julian. But I tell you, nature plays tricks. A mongrel dog may look like a wolf, but it is still a dog. It has no spirit. It has no mind. It is born to serve, and it will die serving. Silas reached out and grabbed Julian's chin, forcing him to look up. Tell them, Silas commanded. Tell these gentlemen who you are. Julian looked into his father's eyes. He saw the hatred there, but he also saw something else, fear. Fear that the boy was actually a man. Julian swallowed the rage that tasted like bile in his throat. He knew that to fight now was to die. I am your servant, sir, Julian said, his voice calm, clear, and educated, too educated for a slave. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Silas didn't like the tone. It wasn't submissive enough. It sounded like an equal. Silas's grip tightened on Julian's jaw until his knuckles turned white. And Silas hissed. And nothing more, Julian said softly. The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. Silas struck him with the back of his hand, the heavy gold signet ring tearing the skin on Julian's cheek. Julian stumbled back, but did not fall. Blood trickled down his face, a stark red line against his bronze skin. The room was deadly silent. Get out, Silas whispered, wiping his hand on a napkin as if he had touched filth. Get out of my sight before I have you whipped until you can't stand. Julian bowed slightly, a gesture of mocking politeness that only Silas understood, and turned to leave. He walked out of the dining room with his head high, the blood dripping onto his white collar. He didn't go to his small cot in the pantry. He went to the stables. He sat in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the horses, touching the cut on his cheek. That night, something in Julian snapped. Or perhaps, something hardened. He realized that waiting was no longer enough. Survival was no longer enough. He didn't just want freedom. He didn't just want to run away to the north and hide in the cold cities. He wanted Blackwood Manor. He wanted the land that had drunk his mother's sweat. He wanted to sit at that table and look Silas Thorne in the eye, not as a servant, but as the master. The plan began to form in his mind, precise and terrifying. It would require patience that bordered on madness. It would require him to play a game that no one else knew was being played. He needed money. He needed connections. And he needed a war. Rumors were already drifting down from the north, whispers of secession, of conflict, of a breaking point. Julian knew that chaos was a ladder, and he intended to climb it. But first, he had to secure his position. He returned to the house the next morning, his face swollen, and resumed his duties with a terrifying perfection. He became indispensable. He anticipated Silas's needs before Silas even spoke them. He managed the inventory. He fixed the ledgers when the overseer made errors. He made himself the invisible spine of Blackwood Manor. Silas, arrogant and aging, began to rely on him more and more, thinking he had finally broken the boy's spirit. He didn't see the wolf in the room. He didn't see that Julian was learning the price of cotton, the cost of shipping, the names of the creditors in New Orleans. Julian was memorizing the financial anatomy of his father's empire, looking for the rot. And he found it. Silas was rich in land and slaves, but he was poor in cash. He lived on credit, borrowing against next year's harvest to pay for this year's luxuries. It was a fragile house of cards, held together by pride and the assumption that the good times would never end. Julian saw the ledger books late one night, when Silas had passed out from too much brandy. He saw the mounting debts to a bank in Boston. He saw the mortgages layered on top of mortgages. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. The weapon he needed wasn't a gun or a knife. It was debt. And the storm that was coming, the war that everyone feared, was going to be the wind that blew the house of cards down. Julian closed the ledger and extinguished the candle. The darkness of the room felt welcoming. He whispered into the silence, a promise to the ghost of his mother and to the blood on his cheek. "He thinks he owns the earth," Julian said softly. "But he only borrows it. And the rent is coming due." The years between that dinner party and the first rumble of cannon fire were a slow, rotting decline for Blackwood Manor. Though to the naked eye, the paint was still white and the cotton still bloomed. But rot always starts from the inside, in the dark places where no one looks. Silas Thorne, driven by an arrogance that had calcified into madness, began to gamble with a ferocity that terrified even his closest friends. He wasn't just gambling at cards. He was gambling with the market, buying more land he couldn't afford, purchasing more enslaved souls to work fields that were already exhausted. He was trying to fill a hole in his soul with ownership, believing that if he just owned enough, he would finally feel secure. Julian watched it all. He became the silent keeper of the decline. He saw the letters from the bank in Boston turn from polite reminders to curt demands. He saw Silas drinking earlier in the day, his hands shaking until the first glass of brandy steadied them. And amidst this slow collapse, Julian found his weapon. It happened in the library, the sanctuary where Silas rarely set foot anymore, preferring the noise of the racetrack or the stupor of the bottle. Julian had been dusting the high shelves, the ones that required a ladder, when he found a loose panel behind a row of dusty leather-bound history books. Behind the panel was not money, but a journal. It belonged to Silas's father, the original patriarch, a man named Old Elias Thorne. Elias had been a different breed of monster, cold, calculating, and utterly without the flashy vanity of his son. Julian sat on the top step of the ladder, the heavy book in his lap, and read the fading ink by the gray light of the window. The entries were a meticulous record of cruelty, but near the end, written just weeks before Elias died, was an entry that made Julian's breath hitch. "Silas is a fool," the old man had written. "He spends gold like it is water. He will ruin what I built. I have taken precautions. The harvest of 42 was the greatest this land ever saw. I have not banked the surplus. I have buried it, not in the ground where it can rot, but in the foundation, beneath the stone of the old smokehouse, in the iron box. It is the blood of this land, saved for a day of ruin. Let Silas starve before he finds it. Only a man who knows the weight of dirt deserves to hold it." Julian closed the book. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The smokehouse. It was the oldest structure on the estate, a grim, windowless building where meat was cured, the air inside always thick with the smell of salt and hickory. Julian knew every stone of that building. He had spent hours there as a child, hiding from the overseer. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Silas, the legitimate heir, was starving for cash while sleeping 100 yards from a fortune his father had hidden from him. Elias had been right. Silas didn't know the weight of dirt, but Julian did. Julian knew the weight of the dirt, the cotton, the timber, and the lash. He was the heir Elias had written about, even if the old man hadn't known it. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Julian went to the smokehouse. He brought a heavy iron pry bar and a lantern with the wick turned low. The work was brutal. The flagstones were heavy, set deep into the earth. For hours, he dug, his hands blistering, his muscles screaming. He worked with a desperate, silent fury. Finally, his shovel struck metal. A dull, heavy thud. He cleared away the earth and pried open the lid of the rusted iron chest. Inside, stacked in neat, heavy rows, were gold coins. Spanish reals, American eagles, heavy gold bars. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a ship. It was enough to buy freedom. It was enough to buy Blackwood Manor 3 times over. For a moment, Julian just stared at the gold. The flickering lamplight made the coins dance. The temptation to run was overwhelming. He could take a handful, steal a horse, and vanish. He could be free by sunrise. But then he thought of Silas. He thought of the slap. He thought of his mother, Sarah, buried in a pauper's grave on the edge of the property. Running was survival. Staying was justice. Julian closed the lid. He covered the chest with dirt, replaced the flagstones, and swept dust over the cracks until the floor looked undisturbed. He didn't take a single coin. Not yet. He left the weapon where it lay, knowing it was there, waiting for the moment when Silas was weakest. Then came 1861, the year the world broke in two. When the news of the war reached Mississippi, Blackwood Manor erupted in a fever of patriotism. Silas threw a massive ball to celebrate the Confederacy. Men in gray uniforms strutted through the halls, talking of a quick victory, of teaching the Yankees a lesson. Silas, too old to fight but desperate to be a hero, did exactly what Julian knew he would do. He liquidated his remaining stocks, he drained the operational accounts, and he bought Confederate war bonds. He bet everything on the South. He stood on the porch, waving a flag, drunk on brandy and hubris, shouting, "We are invincible. Cotton is king." Julian stood in the shadows of the porch, holding a silver tray of empty glasses. He looked at the paper bonds Silas was waving. To Silas, they were patriotism. To Julian, they were kindling. Julian knew, from his reading of the Northern papers that Silas ignored, that the North had factories, railroads, and ships. The South had pride in cotton. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slow strangulation. And as the blockade tightened around the southern ports, the strangulation began. The first year of the war was a party. The second year was a hangover. By the third year, 1863, Blackwood Manor was a ghost of itself. The imported brandy was gone, replaced by homemade corn whiskey that burned the throat. The silk dresses of the ladies were patched and turned. The coffee ran out, then the salt, then the medicine. And the debt to the Boston Bank didn't care about the war. The Boston bankers were patient. They knew that lines on a map didn't change the ink on a contract. They continued to send letters, now routed through smugglers and third parties, demanding payment. Silas burned them in the fireplace, laughing maniacally. "They can't touch me," he would scream. "We are a new nation." But the new nation was starving. The fields of Blackwood, once white with cotton, now grew weedy corn and sweet potatoes just to feed the household. The overseers, unpaid and conscripted into the army, had vanished. The enslaved population, sensing the shifting wind, began to slip away in the night, heading toward the rumored Union lines. Silas was powerless to stop them. He was a king without an army. His cane tapped angrily on the floorboards of an empty house. It was in this atmosphere of decay that Julian made his first move. He needed a proxy. He couldn't walk into a bank, not yet. He needed a face. He found him in the form of a man named Thaddeus Holt. Holt was a carpetbagger before the term was common, a northern lawyer who had been stuck in Mississippi when the war broke out, feigning neutrality to save his skin. He was a slippery man, motivated by greed, but he hated the southern aristocracy who had snubbed him for years. Julian had met him years ago when Holt had visited Silas for legal work, and Julian had seen the way Holt looked at Silas, with the same hidden loathing that Julian felt. One evening, while Silas was passed out in the parlor, Julian slipped out to the abandoned overseer's cabin where Holt was squatting, hiding from the conscription gangs. Julian didn't come as a servant. He came with a single gold coin, one he had finally retrieved from the hoard, and placed it on the rough table. The gold shone like a small sun in the dim cabin. Holt's eyes widened. He looked at the coin, then at Julian. "There is more where that came from," Julian said, his voice low and steady. "A lot more. Enough to make you a rich man, Mr. Holt. Enough to get you back north when this is over." "What do you want?" Holt asked, licking his lips. He didn't ask where a slave got gold. In war, you didn't ask questions that could get you killed. "I need you to be my voice," Julian said. "I need you to write to the bank in Boston. Tell them Silas Thorne is insolvent. Tell them the estate is ruining. Tell them." Julian paused, a cold smile touching his lips. "Tell them there is a buyer willing to take the debt off their hands for pennies on the dollar. A buyer who pays in gold, not Confederate paper." Holt laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. You? You want to buy the mortgage of Blackwood Manor? It's impossible. Your property, boy. You can't own property." "I am not buying it," Julian corrected him. "You are. You will buy the debt in your name, using my gold. And when the time is right, you will transfer the deed to me. We will draw up a private contract. If you try to cheat me, if you try to take the gold and run, remember that I am the one who knows where the rest of it is buried. You kill the goose, you get no eggs." Holt looked at the man standing before him. He saw the scars on Julian's hands, but he also saw the intelligence in his eyes, the terrifying resolve. This wasn't a slave. This was a partner. It's treason, Holt whispered. Trading with a Boston bank in the middle of the war. It's business, Julian said. And the Confederacy is dying, Mr. Holt. Do you want to die with it? Or do you want to be rich? Holt reached out and covered the coin with his hand. Write the letter, he said. And so, as the cannons thundered in the distance, tearing the country apart, the ink began to flow. Julian dictated, and Holt wrote. They were drafting the death warrant of Silas Thorne's reign, not with a sword, but with a contract. The trap was set. Now, all Julian had to do was wait for the Union Army to arrive, and for the world to turn right side up. The war dragged on, a slow, grinding misery that chewed up the South and spat out bones. By 1864, Blackwood Manor was unrecognizable. The manicured lawns were overgrown with briars. The white paint was peeling in long, gray strips like dead skin. The windows, once shining, were dark and grimy, reflecting the emptiness of the house. Cordelia Thorne had passed away that winter, not from a fever or a bullet, but from a simple lack of will to live in a world that no longer made sense to her. She died in her sleep, and Silas buried her in the family crypt with a hasty, drunken ceremony, more angry at her for leaving him alone than sad at her passing. Julian was now the only one left. The other servants had fled months ago, slipping away into the chaos of the collapsing Confederacy. But Julian stayed. He cooked the meager meals of cornbread and salted pork. He washed Silas's clothes, which hung loosely on his gaunt frame. He kept the fire burning in the library, the only room Silas inhabited anymore. To Silas, Julian's presence was proof of his own enduring power. See, Silas would slur, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. He knows I am still the master. He knows his place. But Julian wasn't staying out of loyalty. He was staying because he was the warden. He was watching his prisoner. The turning point came in the spring of 1865. The news arrived not by telegraph, but by the sound of thunder that didn't stop. The Union Army was coming. General Sherman's march had cut a scar through Georgia, and now the Bluecoats were sweeping through Mississippi, burning the old world to the ground. Silas Thorne barricaded himself in the library with a loaded pistol and a bottle of whiskey. He ranted to the empty room about honor, about fighting to the last man. Julian, meanwhile, was busy. He met Thaddeus Holt in the woods one last time. Holt looked nervous, sweating in his ill-fitting suit. He handed Julian a thick envelope sealed with wax. It's done, Holt whispered, his eyes darting around the trees. The bank in Boston accepted the gold. They didn't care where it came from. The mortgage is paid. The lien is transferred. The deed it's in the name of the Blackwood Trust. And the trustee? Julian asked, his voice calm. Me, Holt said. Until you sign the papers. Then it's you. But Julian, the law. A black man can't own. The law is changing, Thaddeus. Julian interrupted, looking toward the horizon where columns of smoke were rising. The Union Army brings new laws. By next week, I won't be property. I will be a citizen, and I will be the owner of Blackwood Manor. Holt handed over the papers, took his final bag of gold, and vanished into the woods, heading north as fast as his legs could carry him. Julian took the envelope. It felt heavy, heavier than the gold. It was the weight of his entire life. He hid the papers inside his shirt, against his skin, and walked back to the house. The Union troops arrived 2 days later. A regiment of cavalry rode up the overgrown driveway, their horses trampling the weeds. The captain, a weary-looking man with a dusty blue uniform, rode up to the porch. Silas stumbled out the front door, waving his pistol, screaming incoherent curses. Get off my land! Silas shrieked, his voice cracking. I am Silas Thorne. I am the master here. The captain didn't even draw his sword. He just signaled to 2 of his men. Disarm him, he said tiredly. The soldiers dismounted and easily wrestled the gun from the old man's weak grip. They shoved him down onto the porch steps, where he sat, weeping in a mixture of rage and humiliation. Then, Julian stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed in his simple servant's clothes, but he stood straighter than the soldiers. He walked past Silas, who was huddled on the ground, and looked at the captain. I am Julian, he said. I was enslaved here. The captain nodded, tipping his hat. You are a free man now, son. By order of the Emancipation Proclamation and the victory of the United States Army. You are free to go wherever you please. Julian looked at the captain, then down at Silas. "I have nowhere to go," Julian said. "This is my home." The captain shrugged. "Well, you can work for wages now. Or you can leave." The old man. "Well, he's lucky we don't hang him for treason. But he's finished. He's got no money, no slaves, and judging by the look of this place, no crop." The soldiers camped on the lawn that night. They ate their rations, sang songs, and ignored the fallen aristocrat sitting in his dark house. Silas sat in the library, staring into the dead fire. Julian entered the room silently and lit a candle. Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You," he whispered. "You're still here? Why? Go. Go with your Yankee friends. Leave me to die." Julian placed the candle on the desk. He didn't pour Silas a drink. He didn't bow. He pulled the chair, Silas's favorite leather armchair, around to the other side of the desk and sat down. Silas blinked, confused. "What are you doing? Get out of my chair." Julian reached into his shirt and pulled out the envelope. He placed it on the desk between them. The wax seal was broken. "Do you know what this is, Silas?" Julian asked. He didn't call him master. He didn't call him sir. He called him by his name. Silas bristled, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am your father. I am your master." "You are neither," Julian said coldly. "You never acted like a father, and as of today, you are no longer a master. But this." He tapped the envelope. "This is a deed. Or rather, a transfer of debt." Silas squinted at the papers. "What are you talking about? Debt? The Boston Bank. They can't touch me." "They sold your debt, Silas," Julian explained, his voice smooth and steady. "They sold it months ago. To a private trust. The Blackwood Trust. You haven't paid a dime in 3 years. The trust has foreclosed." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Foreclosed? Who is this trust? Some Yankee carpetbagger? I'll fight them. I'll fight them in court." "There is no fight," Julian said. "It's done. The sheriff will be here in the morning to serve the eviction notice. Unless." "Unless what?" Silas demanded. "Who owns this trust? Who is trying to steal my home?" Julian leaned forward into the candlelight. The resemblance was striking now. The same eyes, the same jaw, but one face was ruined by hate, and the other was forged in it. "I do," Julian said. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the wax dripping from the candle. "You?" Silas whispered. "You're lying. You're a slave. You have nothing." "I found grandfather's journal," Julian said. "I found the smokehouse. I found the gold you were too arrogant to look for. I bought your debt, Silas. I own the mortgage. I own the house. I own the land. I own the chair you were sitting in." Silas's face turned a shade of gray that looked like death. He tried to stand, but his legs failed him. He slumped back, gasping. You stole my gold. It was mine. It was my inheritance. It was the fruit of this land," Julian countered. "And I am the only one who tended this land while you drank it away. It belongs to the one who saved it. And now, I am evicting you." "Evicting me?" Silas's voice was a high, thin whine. "Where will I go? This is my home. I have lived here my whole life." "And I have lived here my whole life too," Julian said. "In the pantry. In the stable. You have family in Savannah, don't you? A cousin? I suggest you start walking. Because by noon tomorrow, if you are found on my property, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Silas stared at his son. He looked for a hint of mercy, a crack in the armor. He saw none. He saw only the mirror of his own cruelty, reflected back at him with perfect clarity. "You can't do this," Silas wept. "I am your father." Julian stood up. He picked up the candle, casting Silas into shadow. "No," Julian said, his voice final. "You made it very clear at the dinner table, Silas. You have no son. You have no heir. You only have creditors. And the rent is due." Julian walked out of the library, leaving Silas Thorne in the dark. The next morning broke, clear and bright. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. Julian stood on the porch, wearing a clean suit he had bought from a traveling merchant. He watched as Silas Thorne, a broken old man carrying a single battered suitcase, walked slowly down the long driveway. He walked past the ancient oaks. He walked past the overgrown fields. He didn't look back. Julian watched him until he disappeared around the bend in the road. Then, Julian turned and looked at the house. It was a wreck. It needed paint. It needed a new roof. The fields needed to be cleared. It was a mountain of work. But it was his work. He walked back inside. He went to the dining room. The table was covered in dust. He wiped the spot clean at the head of the table. He pulled out the chair, the master's chair, and sat down. The house was silent, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a blank page. Julian took a deep breath. He was 25 years old. He was a free man. He was the master of Blackwood Manor. And for the first time in his life, the air didn't smell of iron and sweat. It smelled of morning. Victory is a strange thing. You expect it to taste like sweet wine, but mostly, it tastes like ash and exhaustion. Julian sat at the head of that long mahogany table for an hour, listening to the silence of the house. He was the master of Blackwood Manor, yes, but he was also the master of a ruin. The estate was bankrupt. The fields were choked with 3 years of neglect. The barns were empty of livestock, save for a few rats that scurried through the haylofts. And most importantly, he was a black man owning a plantation in the heart of Mississippi in 1865. The war of cannons and bayonets was over, but the war of whispers, laws, and burning torches was just beginning. The first challenge wasn't the white neighbors. It was the people who had once been enslaved there. News traveled fast in the quarters. By noon, faces began to appear at the edge of the woods. Men and women who had hidden in the swamps or camped near the Union lines were returning, cautious and hungry, drawn by the rumor that Silas Thorne was gone. They stood in the overgrown driveway, looking at the big house with a mixture of fear and confusion. They saw Julian standing on the porch, not in a livery uniform, but in a suit, holding the keys to the kingdom. Julian walked down the steps to meet them. He didn't carry a whip. He carried a ledger, the same ledger he had used to condemn Silas. He saw Marcus, a giant of a man who had once been the blacksmith, standing at the front of the group. Marcus had scars on his back that were a map of Silas's temper. He looked at Julian with suspicion. To them, Julian had always been the house boy, the one who lived in the shadow of the master, the one with the master's face. "Is it true?" Marcus asked, his voice rasping like a file on iron. "Old man is gone." "He is gone," Julian said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Evicted. He will not return." "And who is master now?" Marcus asked, spitting into the dust. "The Yankees?" "No," Julian said. "There are no masters here anymore. Not today. I own the deed, Marcus. I bought the debt. But I cannot farm this land alone. I need partners." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Partners? It was a word that didn't exist in their vocabulary. "I am offering contracts," Julian continued, opening the ledger. "Sharecropping contracts, but fair ones. 50-50 split of the harvest. I provide the seed, the tools, and the land. You provide the labor, and I pay wages for the repair work on the house and barns. Real money. Greenbacks." Marcus crossed his massive arms. "You got greenbacks, Julian? Or is this another Thorne lie?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of the gold coins he had saved. He tossed one to Marcus. The big man caught it, bit it, and looked at Julian with widened eyes. "It's real," Marcus grunted. "I am not your master," Julian said, looking into the eyes of the people he had grown up with. "I am your employer. If you don't like the terms, you are free to walk down that road and never look back. But if you stay, we build this place back. Not for Silas Thorne. For us." It was a speech that would have been impossible a week ago. And it worked. Not everyone stayed. Some were too scarred by the memories of Blackwood to ever sleep on that soil again, but many did. They needed homes, and they needed work. By sunset, the plantation was alive again. But this time, the rhythm was different. It wasn't the slow, forced march of slavery. It was the frantic, energetic pace of men working for their own future. Hammers rang out repairing the fences. Scythes hissed through the tall weeds. The smell of cooking fires rose from the quarters, but the air felt lighter. However, if the estate was finding a new peace, the county was brewing a new storm. Julian knew he couldn't hide in Blackwood forever. He needed supplies. He needed seed corn, nails, glass for the windows, and flour for the winter. 2 days after taking control, he hitched the only remaining mule to an old wagon and drove into town. The town of Oakhaven was a battered collection of wooden buildings that had survived the war, though just barely. Union soldiers patrolled the streets, looking bored and hot in their blue wool. But the locals, the white men sitting on the porches of the general store, watched them with eyes like flint. When Julian rolled into town, the conversation on the porches stopped. They knew him. They knew him as Silas's bastard. They knew him as the slave who walked too tall. But they didn't know yet that he was the owner of the largest estate in the county. Julian tied the mule to the rail and walked up the steps of the general store. The owner, a man named Mr. Abernathy, was behind the counter, weighing out sugar. He froze when Julian walked in. Abernathy had been a friend of Silas. He had drunk Silas's brandy and laughed at Silas's jokes. "We don't serve your kind in here, boy, unless you got a note from your master," Abernathy sneered, not looking up. "I don't have a master," Julian said, placing a list on the counter. "And I have money. I need 50 bushels of seed corn, a barrel of nails, and 10 sacks of flour." Abernathy looked up then. He saw the suit. He saw the gold coin Julian placed on the wood. His face turned a mottled red. "I heard rumors," Abernathy spat. "I heard Silas was run off. I heard some Yankee trickery was afoot. You think because you stole a suit and found some gold, you can buy from me?" "It's legal tender," Julian said. "Do you want the sale or not?" Abernathy leaned over the counter, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "I'd rather burn my store to the ground than sell seed to a black man who thinks he's a planter. Get out, before I call the boys." The boys referred to the men outside, who were now standing up, hands hovering near the pistols tucked into their waistbands. Julian looked at Abernathy, then at the gold coin. He picked it up. "Your choice," Julian said calmly. "But the Union garrison is just down the street. I assume you don't want a disturbance that would bring the provost marshal here to check your books?" Abernathy hesitated. The fear of the Union soldiers was the only thing stronger than his hatred. He gritted his teeth. "Take your goods," he hissed. "But don't expect me to load them. And don't come back." Julian loaded the wagon himself, feeling the eyes of the town burning into his back. Every sack of flour was a heavy reminder that while he had the paper deed, he didn't have the respect. He was an island in a sea of hostility. As he drove out of town, a rock struck the side of the wagon. He didn't flinch. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. But the rock was just a warning. The real threat came a week later. The work on the farm was progressing. The fields were cleared, and the planting had begun. Julian worked alongside Marcus and the others, his hands blistering, his suit replaced by rough work clothes. He wanted to show them that he wasn't afraid to sweat. But one morning, as the mist was lifting off the river, Marcus came running up to the back porch where Julian was drinking coffee. "Boss," Marcus said, breathless, "you better come see this." Julian followed him to the edge of the property, where the main road met the driveway. There, nailed to the ancient oak tree, was a sign. It was crude, painted in red, likely blood. It read, "The rope is waiting. Leave or hang." And below the sign, lying in the dust, was the carcass of a dog. It wasn't just any dog. It was a stray that Julian had started feeding, a scruffy mongrel that had taken to sleeping on the porch. Its throat had been cut. Julian stared at the dead animal. He felt a cold rage settling in his stomach, replacing the fear. This was the language of the South he knew too well. Violence, intimidation, terror. They wanted him to run. They wanted him to prove Silas right, that he was just a piece of furniture pretending to be a man. Marcus was watching him, holding a shovel. The other workers had gathered around, their faces grim. They were waiting to see what the new master would do. If he ran, they would have to run too. If he folded, the dream was over. Julian turned to Marcus. "Bury the dog," he said quietly. "Bury him by the garden." "And Marcus?" "Yeah, boss. Go to the barn. Open the crate I brought back from the city yesterday." "What's in the crate?" Marcus asked. "Winchester rifles," Julian said. 7 of them. "And ammunition." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who was tired of running. "Tonight," Julian announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "we post guards. If anyone comes up that driveway who doesn't belong here, if anyone rides masked, you do not fire a warning shot. Do you understand?" "We understand," the men chorused. Julian looked back at the sign on the tree. He reached up and ripped it down, crumpling the blood-stained wood in his hands. He wasn't Silas Thorne. He wouldn't hide in the library with a bottle. He was the son of the soil, and he knew something Silas never learned. A man who has nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man who has a home to defend is unstoppable. That night, Blackwood Manor didn't sleep. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the newly tilled fields. Julian sat on the porch, a rifle across his knees, rocking slowly in Silas's chair. He watched the tree line. He listened to the crickets. And he waited. He knew they would come. Not the neighbors like Abernathy. They were cowards. But the others. The night riders. The men who wore hoods because they couldn't bear to show their faces to God. Let them come, Julian thought. The rent is due. They came exactly as Julian knew they would. At 2 in the morning, the silence of the Mississippi Delta was shattered by the rhythmic thudding of hooves on the dirt road. It sounded like a rolling drumbeat of doom. From the darkness of the porch, Julian watched the orange glow of torches bobbing above the tree line. There were 20 of them, maybe 30. They rode with the arrogance of men who believed the night belonged to them, their faces hidden behind rough burlap sacks with holes cut for eyes. The early uniform of the hate that was sweeping the South. Steady, Julian whispered. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Marcus was crouched behind the rain barrel to his left. 2 other men, Elias and Samuel, were positioned on the roof of the smokehouse. The rest were hidden in the ditch that ran alongside the driveway, their new Winchester rifles resting on the dirt berm. The riders slowed as they approached the main house. They expected a sleeping plantation. They expected to ride up, throw their torches through the windows, drag Julian out, and leave a burning ruin as a lesson to the county. They didn't expect a fortress. The leader, a big man on a white horse, rode forward, waving a torch. "Come out, boy," the leader shouted, his voice muffled by the mask. "Come out and take your medicine. You think you can steal a white man's land? We're here to evict you straight to hell." Julian stood up from the rocking chair. He stepped into the pool of moonlight at the top of the stairs. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the floor. "You are trespassing," Julian called out. His voice was calm, cutting through the humid air like a blade. "Turn around. Right away. And tell your friends that Blackwood is closed for business." The leader laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Did you hear that, boys? The shadow thinks he gives orders." He raised his torch high. "Burn it. Burn it all." The riders spurred their horses forward, shouting war cries. "Now," Julian said. The night exploded. It wasn't a chaotic volley of musket fire. It was the precise, rapid cracking of lever-action rifles. The Winchesters, capable of firing as fast as a man could work the lever, unleashed a wall of lead. But Julian had given strict orders. Shoot the horses, not the men, unless you have to. The first volley hit the dirt in front of the charging line, kicking up clouds of dust. The second volley took down the leader's white horse. The animal screamed and buckled, sending the riders sprawling into the dirt. Chaos erupted in the ranks of the night riders. Horses panicked, rearing and throwing their riders. The torchlight spun wildly as men scrambled to control their mounts. "Light them up," Marcus roared from the side. From the roof and the ditches, the gunfire continued, a relentless suppression. Bullets whizzed past the riders' heads, shattering the glass of their lanterns, splintering the fence posts. The riders, armed mostly with slow-loading pistols and shotguns, were completely outgunned. They were facing a disciplined infantry unit, not a frightened group of farmhands. The leader, scrambling in the dirt, lost his mask. It was Mr. Abernathy, the store owner. He looked up at the porch, his eyes wide with terror, seeing Julian standing there like an avenging angel amidst the smoke. "Go home, Abernathy," Julian shouted over the noise. "Before I aim higher." Abernathy scrambled to his feet, abandoning his horse, and ran back toward the road. Panic is contagious. Seeing their leader run, the other riders broke. They wheeled their horses around, dropping their torches in the dirt, and galloped away into the darkness, leaving a trail of dust and shame behind them. Silence returned to Blackwood Manor, broken only by the heavy breathing of the men and the groans of the injured horse. Julian walked down the steps. Marcus came out from behind the barrel, grinning, the adrenaline making his hands shake. "We ran him off, boss. Did you see them run?" Marcus slapped his thigh. "They ran like rabbits." "They'll be back," Julian said, his face grim. "Or the law will. Clear the road. Put the fire out. And Marcus, put the horse out of its misery." Julian walked back into the house. He didn't celebrate. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the dining table. His hand was trembling slightly. He had just declared war on the entire social order of Mississippi. The retaliation came 3 days later, but it didn't come with torches. It came with a badge. Sheriff Cobb was a man who looked like he was carved out of suet, pale, heavy, and sweating grease. He rode up the driveway in a buggy, accompanied by 2 deputies. He didn't get out. He waited for Julian to come to him. "You're in a heap of trouble, Julian," Cobb said, chewing on a matchstick. "I got reports of an ambush. Attempted murder of decent citizens. Inciting a riot. I have reports of trespassing and arson," Julian replied, standing by the gate. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "I defended my property against armed intruders. Under the laws of this state and the laws of the United States, a man has a right to defend his home. Or does that law only apply to white men, Sheriff?" Cobb spat the matchstick out. "Don't quote law to me, boy. You're skating on thin ice. The town is howling for blood. They say you're building an army out here. They say you're planning an insurrection." "I am planning a harvest," Julian said. "My men are employees. They are paid wages. They are armed because the sheriff won't do his job and protect this property." Cobb's face purpled. "You watch your mouth. I could arrest you right now." "On what charge?" Julian asked. "And before you answer, you should know that I have sent a letter to the distinct commander of the Union occupation forces in Vicksburg. I detailed the attack, the names of the men I recognized, including Mr. Abernathy, and I requested a federal inquiry into why local law enforcement is allowing Klan activity." It was a bluff. Julian hadn't sent the letter yet. But Cobb didn't know that. The fear of federal intervention was the only thing that kept the local law in check. Cobb knew that if the feds came down, he'd lose his job and maybe his freedom. Cobb stared at Julian for a long time. He saw the intelligence in Julian's eyes, the utter lack of fear. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that this wasn't just a rebellious ex-slave. This was a man who knew how to play the game better than they did. "You're making enemies you can't handle," Cobb muttered, pulling the reins. "The army won't be here forever, Julian. One day, the bluecoats will go home, and then it'll just be us. You remember that?" "I'll remember," Julian said. "Good day, Sheriff." Cobb turned the buggy around and left. Julian let out a breath he had been holding. He knew Cobb was right. The Union protection was a shield that was slowly rusting. He needed to secure his position before the soldiers left. He needed money. Real money. The harvest of 1865 was the turning point. While the other plantations in the county struggled with labor shortages, because the owners refused to pay wages and the freedmen refused to work for free, Blackwood Manor flourished. Julian's workers, motivated by the 50-50 split, worked from dawn till dusk. The cotton came in high and white. Julian bypassed Abernathy and the local buyers who tried to cheat him. He hired a barge on the river and took his cotton all the way to New Orleans himself. He walked into the cotton exchange, a black man in a tailored suit, surrounded by white brokers who looked at him like he was a zoo animal. But cotton is colorblind. When they saw the quality of his bales, the greed took over. Julian sold his crop for top dollar in gold and federal notes. He returned to Blackwood Manor not just solvent, but rich. He paid off the last of the lingering small debts. He paid his workers their share, handing out stacks of greenbacks that made grown men weep. Marcus bought a suit. Samuel bought a plot of land of his own down the road. But Julian didn't spend his money on luxuries. He spent it on power. He started buying up the tax liens of his neighbors. The same men who had ridden with torches were now going broke, unable to manage their estates without slave labor. One by one, their farms came up for auction. And one by one, Julian bought them. He didn't evict them. That was the genius of his revenge. He kept them on the land as tenants. He became the landlord of the men who had once gathered at Silas's table to mock him. He controlled their credit. He controlled their rent. He owned the roofs over their heads. By 1868, Julian Thorne, he had legally adopted the name, forcing the county to write it in the courthouse ledger, owned half the county. He built a school on the Blackwood grounds for the children of his workers. He hired a teacher from the north. He built a church. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. The hatred in the county didn't disappear. It just went underground, festering like an infection. Silas Thorne was still out there, living in a squalid boarding house in the next town, drinking away the few coins he begged, telling anyone who would listen that his throne had been stolen by a devil. And then, the letter came. It wasn't from a bank. It wasn't from the sheriff. It was from a woman. "Dear Mr. Thorne," the letter read, written in a shaky, elegant hand. "You do not know me, but I knew your mother. I was with her when she died. There is something you must know. Something Silas kept hidden even from himself. Meet me at the old willow by the river at sunset. Come alone. Julian stared at the letter. It was signed Martha. He remembered Martha. She was an old woman now, once the midwife of the plantation. Marcus watched him read it. It's a trap, boss, Marcus said. You go down there alone, you get a bullet in the back. Maybe, Julian said, folding the paper. But if she knows about my mother, I have to go. He took his revolver, tucked it into his waistband, and walked out into the twilight. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. He walked to the river, the sound of the water masking his footsteps. He didn't know that this meeting would reveal the final secret of Blackwood Manor, a secret that would threaten to undo everything he had built, not by force, but by blood. The willow tree trailed its long, sorrowful branches into the dark water of the Mississippi River. The air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the slow, rhythmic lap of the current against the mud bank. Julian stood in the shadow of the tree, his hand resting near the revolver at his waist. He saw Martha sitting on a fallen log, her silhouette small and hunched against the twilight. I'm here, Martha, Julian said softly. The old woman looked up. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes cloudy with cataracts. She didn't stand. She just pointed a trembling finger toward the dense underbrush behind him. I didn't want to bring you here, child, she whispered, her voice cracking with tears. But he made me. He said he'd burn my cabin down. Julian didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He heard the click of a hammer being pulled back on a pistol. It was a sound he knew well. Hello, boy. Silas Thorne's voice rasped from the darkness. Julian stood perfectly still. Silas, I thought you had walked to Savannah. I don't walk away from what is mine. Silas stepped out from the brush. He looked like a scarecrow dressed in rags. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and feverish, and in his shaking hand, he held an old dueling pistol. You took my house. You took my name. You took my life. I took nothing, Julian said, his voice calm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. I bought it. With the gold you were too lazy to dig up. It was my father's gold. Silas screamed, the gun wavering. My blood. You are a thief. You are a mongrel thief. Shoot. Then, Julian said, turning slowly to face him. He didn't draw his own weapon. He looked his father in the eye. Shoot me, Silas. And what happens? The sheriff hangs you. The land goes to the state. You still lose. I'd rather it rot than belong to you, Silas sneered. He leveled the pistol at Julian's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. But the shot never came. A dry, rattling cough tore through Silas's chest. His body, weakened by months of starvation and cheap whiskey, finally betrayed him. He doubled over, gasping for air, the pistol dropping from his hand into the mud. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. Julian watched him fall. He didn't move to help. He didn't move to strike. He simply watched. Silas looked up, his eyes wide with fear, realizing that the end was not grand, but pathetic. He reached a hand out toward Julian. Help me, he wheezed. I am your father. Julian looked down at the man who had given him life, and then tried to crush it. He saw the cruelty, the vanity, and finally, the ultimate weakness. No, Julian said softly, the word carrying the weight of a final judgment. You were just a man who owned me. Silas Thorne died in the mud, grasping at the hem of his son's trousers. Julian didn't bury him in the family crypt. He buried him on the edge of the property, outside the fence, under a simple stone marker that bore no name, only the date. It was the final erasure. Years passed. Blackwood Manor ceased to exist. Julian repainted the house a soft yellow. He tore down the whipping post and used the wood to build the frame of the schoolhouse. He renamed the estate Sarah's Promise. Julian married a woman named Clara, a teacher from the north, and they filled the house with children who never knew the sound of chains. They only knew the sound of laughter in the hallways where silence had once reigned. One evening, decades later, Julian sat on the porch, his hair now white as cotton. He watched the sun set over the fields that were worked by free men who owned their own harvest. His youngest grandson climbed onto his lap, tracing the old scar on Julian's cheek. Grandpa, the boy asked, who gave you that mark? Julian smiled, pulling the boy close, feeling the warmth of a legacy that was finally, truly his. A ghost, Julian whispered. Just a ghost. But he's gone now. And we are still here.